thank you, Cal, for bringing us in. Strange Adventures, amazing store. Really great to be here, having a great weekend. So thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
One quick confession to make, man. Cal wore us down. We came here under a top secret mission from the U.S. government because we heard that some bastard a couple hundred years ago burnt down our White House, and we were coming here to exact revenge. But Cal, he welcomed us into the town, showed us the sights. We got some lobster yesterday, and we decided to defect. So effective immediately, we no longer say the word about, we say about, and we no longer say process, we say process. We're in this beautiful library setting, Jim.
Yeah, I love libraries. Very excited to be here for that reason. When I was a kid, I was, I guess poor is the word, and I kind of lived at my local library, but unfortunately they had very, very few comics at that point, or else I'd probably be a better cartoonist if I had access when I was younger.
I know what you mean.
But I love the libraries, and over the last probably 15 or 20 years, seeing libraries adopt comics and graphic novels has been one of the highlights of my life. I absolutely love it. If you watch the show, you know that we are comic book nerds. I have rooms full of comics. I still buy lots of comics, but I also use my local library for comics. And thinking about comics and libraries, I realized I read differently whenever I get a book out of the library, because it's almost like I have a deadline. Whenever I buy books or get books, I have several very large to-read piles, and once I own the book, it's not as urgent that I read it.
Right.
Whenever I check a book out of the library, it's like I have the ticking clock to remind me you only have so much time to get into this. So sometimes it's a great incentive for me to actually get into a book. And I thought I'd mention a couple of the recent books that I've gotten out of the library and enjoyed. Nick Dornasso's Sabrina. It's a big graphic novel about conspiracy theory. One of the topics we touch on a little bit, I'm a fan of conspiracy theory, fiction, I suppose, maybe not fiction, storytelling, let's say. And that was a really enjoyable graphic novel that I got out of my local library. And recently I got Tilly Walden's Spinning out one night. I do a lot of young adult comics and graphic novels. So Tilly Walden's Spinning is about her experience as a figure skater growing up. And I decided that I needed to read it one night. And lo and behold, it was available as a digital copy from my library. So I was reading it within minutes of the impulse. So very nice, very interesting to see how comics and libraries are existing.
Inspector Gadget, this message will self-destruct in 3 weeks. How does that work?
You just wake up one day and it's gone. My wife loves to read real books, as she calls them. Not sure what the difference is, especially when they're on her iPad. But frequently they expire before she's done, and it is it's a race. It's a race to that expiration date on the last day.
Can I rewind things back a little bit, Jimmy?
Yes.
Because I am curious if people even know what the heck our YouTube channel is. I see a couple Kayfabe shirts in the crowd, but can I get a quick show of hands? Who knows what Cartoonist Kayfabe is? All right, not bad, man, but it's not unanimous, so perhaps we should explain a little bit what the channel is.
Just tell them who we are and what we do.
Yeah, so we started this, Jim and I was born in 82. What year were you born?
1977.
We're products of as comic fans, we're products of the 1990s speculator boom, which was just the most ridiculous time in comics, where it was an exercise in adults doing everything they possibly could to divest us of our hard-earned allowance money as young boys, and they did that in many different ways. They would put a #1 on the cover of a comic, and we would make sure to buy every single one of those. Sometimes people would buy 50 of those with the promise and hope that they were going to be able to pay for their college with those comics. And of course, if you have 8 million of something, there's not necessarily much scarcity involved. You could get those things for a quarter nowadays, so bad investment there. But there was an excitement that went along with that, and the energy of that period, and frankly, the sort of gold rush of that moment made it a situation where my folks gave me no static about growing up to become a cartoonist. They left me to my devices so that I could just sit around drawing comics all day. They gave me no trouble. They put no sort of glass ceiling over my head or any doubts in my mind. So I grew up to become a cartoonist, but I still have fondness for that era of comics, even though a lot of it is claptrap, nonsense, trash. You will not find it in this beautiful library setting. I did kind of take a peek, try to see if you had some spawns down there. Didn't see any.
Yeah, so one of the documents that was coming out at that time to sort of capitalize on the speculator boom was a magazine called Wizard. And it really chronicled this whole explosion of comics everywhere and all of the publishers that popped up and creators forming their own companies in this very exciting time. And we were certainly reading that magazine at the time because we both wanted to be cartoonists, and you would see pages in progress and interviews with cartoonists, which were pretty hard to come by before the internet. So as aspiring cartoonists, this was maybe the best thing we had. It's often ridiculed, but lots of us read it. It outsold most comic books in this time period when comics were selling millions of copies. And so because it was derided, they kind of would get thrown out. I know lots of comic book shop owners who say whenever those come in with collections, they just throw the wizards away.
Put it at the bottom of the bird cage.
Yes. So, cut to 20 years later, and for whatever reason, we go back and start looking at those things again, and it's almost like a drug experience. You can almost feel like neuro pathways firing that haven't been dusted off in 20 years. It was a very real feeling of looking through those magazines and having like all that information rush back in. And we were having these conversations with each other and a couple other friends in town and realized that it might interest more than just us.
Yeah, it's true. When I rediscovered Wizard magazine, they sometimes, a free comic book day, there'll be associated sales to go along with that sometimes at various stores. And I was taking a look in like the old dustbin at this one shop, and I found, not only did I find Wizard magazine, but I found the very first Wizard that I got my hands on.
Those are very special.
They're special because we were kids, we had very little cash, and that specific issue is something I read and reread and reread and reread many, 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 many times, internalized every single page of that thing. And when I saw it again for the first time in 25 years, the word nostalgia isn't powerful enough. It's a different feeling. Like, I know what nostalgia feels like, and the sort of head rush I got from this thing was much different. And an exercise with the channel is to try to kind of share that experience and try to bring that experience back into many of the readers who have experienced these magazines too. In an era where the comic book industry had almost $500 million kind of capital to play around with as in total, this magazine owned like 3.5% of that. Just one magazine that came out every month, man. So it did have a big readership, but we've expanded beyond that. What are some of the things that we've done since?
Well, one other piece to how this channel comes together. Ed and I are more or less self-taught as cartoonists. It's something we wanted to do from an early age. And once we met each other, we started attending comic book shows together. And this meant a lot of traveling down the road, driving to these shows that sometimes would be a day's drive. And I often refer to those car rides because it was just a couple of cartoonists in a car. Guess what we were talking about the entire time? I often refer to that as like, that's my master's degree in cartooning. And we would have other people travel with us and stuff, and it just seemed like people enjoy this kind of topic. Maybe we'll try to expand on it. And so once we started the Cartoonist Kayfabe channel, Wizard was our beginning point, and it was kind of like, let's look at the history chronologically of the 90s, of this very interesting time period. Since then, we continue to expand to reflect our interest as cartoonists. As you can imagine, we are not personally stuck back in the 90s. We're still making comics, we're reading new comics.
Though this one rules. I recommend everybody get that in your collection.
So we've expanded to include beyond Wizard shows. We do a weekly show where we talk about what we're working on. Whenever we first met each other, and this is pretty common with cartoonists, you meet at comic book shops. We have some great comic book shops in Pittsburgh. It's a very good comic book city. And so we started meeting on what's known as New Comic Book Day. Once a week, same day every week, shops get all of their new comics. It's kind of a holy day if you're a cartoonist, or if you're a comic book fan. And so we would all meet up, there were maybe half a dozen of us or so, every week, and we would bring like whatever pages we were working on. And it was almost like positive peer pressure, like you didn't want to show up without pages. And we'd talk shop and we'd trade comic books and influences and stuff that we found exciting but the other people hadn't heard of. And so we did that weekly for a couple of years.
Yeah.
And it's when we really kind of broke into comics around that time period. And then as you get busy, you drift away from each other. So we've I realized these weekly get-togethers, it's a reunion of that. It's a renewal of that practice where we get together, we see what we've worked on that week, we talk about what we've read and seen, and if there's big comic book news that week, something that catches our imagination. So that's one of the shows that we do every week.
Yeah, and we have very extensive, vast collections of comic books. Tens of thousands in my space. I'm sure you have tens of thousands. Graphic novels, magazines, zines, mini comics, and we have some crazy, rare, weirdo stuff that we can't help but put under the microscope, as we call it, and unpack. And some of that stuff is actually even here, man. Big Numbers #1. We just did. That's another thing that we do with the channel that has been happening lately. Is we have this opportunity to travel. Thank you guys so much for welcoming us into your town. When we visit different cities, we're sometimes able to accumulate what we call shoot interviews. And this ditty right here, Big Numbers by Alan Moore and Bill Sienkiewicz, artwork by the great Bill Sienkiewicz. We had the opportunity to do a shoot interview with that guy. He has a long storied career in the history of comics, and as fans, we've read many interviews with the guy, but also as practitioners of the craft, we know the questions that he's never been asked. We know the questions that the cartoonists that we like and adore, they've never been asked in any real journalistic fashion. So we have the tools, we've developed the technology and the ability to be able to ask the questions that everybody's always wanted to hear from these guys, and it's been great capturing some of that footage on the record.
So much of what we're doing with the channel is pretty much an extension of what we've been doing with our lives for most of them.
We have our 10,000 hours together talking to one another.
Yeah. We also do show and tells. This is where we just pull something out of the collection that we're excited about. As Ed said, we have a lot of weird objects that we've accumulated from years of traveling to different shows and meeting different cartoonists. Sometimes it's very mainstream stuff that we're showing off, from something like Todd McFarlane early art, for example, to some obscure mini comic zine. And it's a chance to just kind of share and talk about our collections, which if you all are collectors, you probably know that's a very fun thing to do whenever your friends get together, to be able to pull out something new and exciting that they haven't seen and show that off a little bit. So that's one of the things that has been fun on the channel.
Jim, did you say Todd McFarlane because he's Canadian and has invaded the American scene and is probably the most successful guy from up here?
Are you accusing me of pandering, Ed?
Yeah, man. Hello, Vancouver. It's like, no, I'm just playing. So the library setting, we were kids in the 90s, and comic shops were ubiquitous. In the town that I came from, there were 3 comic shops, quote-unquote comic shops, because it was really serial entrepreneurs, like trying to get into that pie of the $500 million I just described.
What else could you get at some of those comic shops, Ed?
What could you get? You could get dice, sports cards, like a Michael Jordan rookie, but I think you're leading me in a direction. So what would that? Oh, yes, there was the one that I used to go to get my Image comics. It was called the Allentown Bakery, and you literally had to walk past the bread and the muffins, go back into what was probably a storage closet, but they had what's called a Diamond account. Comics require distribution, and the current distributor is called Diamond. So this bakery heard that there's money in comics, and they got an account with Diamond for distribution, and they sold some comic books. So walk past the dough, get some comics. Of course, stores like that disappeared, but I bring up that idea of those comic stores in the 90s and how they were an influence on us, because I think by and large right now, it's the library setting that is most responsible for creating new readership in comics.
Yeah, I agree totally. That's, it goes back to what I was saying about the value of libraries for readers. And it's one of the more encouraging things. Comics tend to doom and gloom at times. And the outreach and getting to readers through libraries has been, I think, one of the high points probably in the last 10 to 15 years. So it's very exciting, and it makes me think about how libraries shelve their comics. We were looking through some of the library's collection downstairs before we came here, and we're trying to figure out, like, how are these organized? And I believe they were organized by author last name for the most part. I don't think that's the best way to organize comics. I'm an advocate for title alphabetizing.
It makes sense. It takes care of a lot of issues. Like when we were down there, you saw anthologies, and the anthologies seem to be by title, because what are you going to do? Choose the editor, the person who did the least amount of work?
Yes, exactly. Although I don't know if I think anthologies are a challenge.
You're being political.
You are right about that. The other thing that is wrong with doing the author or the writer is, like, why not the artist? And it gets very complicated, because oftentimes great writers and great artists work together on books. From Hell is an example. Eddie Campbell, beautiful art. Alan Moore, great writer. it's hard to weigh those guys against each other. So I feel like title is the best way to organize these collections.
Yeah, I think it's the only way, especially the fact that words and pictures are the storytelling of the thing. So it's not like picture books where the writer is sort of giving every indication to the illustrator, like what's supposed to be done right here. Certainly a lot of these older Marvel comics that were written by what they call the Marvel method, which is Stan Lee just talks to the artist for a couple of minutes, tells them that this issue, Spider-Man fights the Green Goblin and somebody's neck gets broken. And then it's up to the guy.
I'm trying to remember that issue of Spider-Man.
A classic freaking issue. Okay, it was Jerry Conway who wrote it, but please. Anyhow, it was pretty much up to the artist to do the storytelling sans the actual verbiage coming out of the characters' mouths. That was then left up to Stan Lee to like have Peter Parker say whatever. The marriage between storytellers is too close when it comes to the craft of comics. It seems like title is apropos.
Yeah, we have, as you go to comic book shops, which is one of my favorite things to do when I'm traveling, you start to see just how many different systems of organization exist. Sometimes shops will break their collections into things like genre, which is challenging. You know, anytime you get to the edges of the lines of these classifications, it gets very hard to figure out. And sometimes it's very hard to navigate when you're in the shop and you're trying to figure out, when you're looking for something like, what is the organization here? We have shops back home that organize by publisher, which used to be a very common thing. People would be Marvel zombies or DC loyalists. And that works for Marvel and DC, but when you start to get into independently published titles, who even knows some of these companies? And it becomes very, very difficult to find a book. So that's my collection. Although I should add, I don't practice it totally.
No?
No. I have my long boxes in alphanumerical order, which is great for show reference whenever we need to pull out a comic to show on camera because we're talking about some specific piece of it. That works really well. But of course, there's more than comic books in our collections. So my graphic novels, my book collection has no organization whatsoever. It's just scattered around shelves throughout the house. Mini comics are, I'm not sure I will ever be up to the task.
What's a mini comic?
Mini comics are usually handmade comics. They come in a variety of sizes. Because they're handmade, you can make them any size that you want. That makes it very, very difficult to shelf and to organize.
Right.
And then there are oversized books, which are sort of like giant versions of mini comics. They don't fit comfortably in boxes. They don't fit comfortably on shelves. And they don't organize very well. But one of my wish lists for the show, I'm hoping to find an intern for Ed.
Why is that?
Because Ed has a very vast collection of long boxes that are mostly unsorted.
It's true. My pops, he really likes those what are those shows where they go to those storage units and bid on them and just get collections? Like my dad's one of those kinds of guys who goes to yard sales and that sort of thing, and I'll get random calls. In fact, on my 30th birthday, I got the greatest birthday present ever. You know, I'm a man at that point, and he's like, "Hey, boy, come on over." And I'm like, "What do you want, man?" He's like, "I got 19 boxes of comics over here for you. Got them for $50 at a yard sale." And just the accumulation of all that stuff it goes over here. I have comics to draw, you know, but then you get 5 or 6 of those collections, and now you have tens of thousands of comics in a very random order. I kind of know where things are. I know the general geography of where they are. Like, yeah, it's in that section of 25 boxes over there. But as a maker of comics, you know, I'd sort of defer to the great DJs of hip hop and rap music, and their whole thing is like, if you're counting your records, you're not making music. If you're like sitting around fussing around with organizing your records, you're not making music. But it definitely is inconvenient when it comes to this new thing that we've created, which is the Cartoonist Kayfabe channel, because most of the time, if you have the damn comic, I'm leaving it up to you to pull that out of your alphanumeric piles of stuff.
2 thoughts. First, I'm infinitely jealous that your dad has pulled these kind of collections out of thin air several times. I have never done that. I go to flea markets and yard sales and garage sales, and I have never found one of these collections. He's found like 6 of them.
Here's what's crazier. That one was maybe 50 paces from the front door of my house. It inspired me start knocking on doors, man, like in the neighborhood, like, hi, I'm Ed, I make comics and I'm looking for some.
Well,
Almost had the first appearance of Sabretooth 100 feet away.
all that time, they were just storing it for you.
I don't know what that is in meters, by the way. Apologies.
Oh,
Unless
yeah.
you guys use feet.
We might be confusing our audience
I did
here.
say Celsius temperatures.
It does make me jealous, though, that he seems to be almost have a knack for finding those kinds of things.
And the extra part of it, the part that is like those storage unit finder guys, is like, he really likes when I'm like, yeah, Dad, this comic would pay for the entire collection. You know, that's $50 that you spent. This one is worth $50.
Man,
and
you
so
need
is
to-
this one.
You need to do that even if it's not true, because he doesn't know what those comics are worth. Butter him up, man. Keep him excited to be on the hunt.
He knows how to press my buttons. He can tell when I'm lying. He has a lot of experience in that when I was a young boy, man, trying to pull one over on him.
My wife is not a big comics reader, so she's not always thrilled with the amount of square footage my comics collection takes up. But one of the nice things about this channel, probably 15 years ago or so, I went through and got rid of most of my comic books. And I've been buying them back ever since. Sometimes literally the same exact comics. I don't know how I feel about that part. But
Like the ones that you had your hands
literally,
on?
it's my Gunfighters from Hell #4.
Wow, I didn't even know that.
Yes.
We'll save that for a later date.
It's happened a couple of times. But the nice thing with this channel is now I don't have to get rid of anything. I feel like this channel is my justification. And I've done that with several comic book projects that I make. I like to call research. So I figure out whatever subject I'm super into, that's what the book will be about. And then anything I do related to that, it's perfect. It's the perfect excuse.
That's how I've manufactured my career for the past 16 years, man. Like doing that X-Men Grand Design book. It's like I have all these X-Men comics. I kind of want an excuse to reread them all, but I also need to maintain some sort of productivity, as the Canadians would say. And the way that I found that I can make that possible was to spend a couple of years making a damn X-Men comic. You know, I justified my 2 months of rereading all of my favorite stuff, and even before that, Hip Hop Family Tree. It's like I love these rap records. I want to learn more about the construction of them. Why not do that? Why not read a bunch of material on the subject, magazines, whatnot, watch the documentaries, and then make some comics on the subject? So Cartoonist, Kayfabe, it's like, can I tell you how many times I read this frickin' comic? And now I get to read it again with more sort of skin in the game. I sort of know the tricks behind the curtain, and then I could make some real opinions on the...
You know how the IRS can come after you for like back taxes, past years and things? It's too bad we can't write off like the back purchases. I should be able to write off comics I've been buying for the last 30 years.
I have a theory about that. We can't do that, and that's unfortunate, but as makers in the game, I'm getting retroactive money back from Marvel Comics for all the damn Marvel Comics I bought when I was a little boy. Like, that's the way it works. You know, Fantagraphics, Love and Rockets, 8 Balls. Hey, do you know how many formats I own, like the Jaime Hernandez stories of Love and Rockets, man? Fantagraphics needs to give me some money back. Okay, so I make a book with them and then I get royalties. It works out. You're not going to hear me complain.
That's a good way to look at it, Ed. Do you guys have any questions? As we go through, we have several things that we'll probably be covering, but we can kind of mix in questions as we go along if anybody has any at this time.
Little dude.
How old were you when you got into comics?
When you say got into comics, do you mean as fans or working in...
As fans.
Since before I was... The question is for the microphone. The question is how young were we when we got into comics as fans? And I can easily say that I got into them before I was even able to read the English language. I was getting them... they were easier to get. Are you a comics fan?
Yeah.
And how did you discover them?
My father told me about them and we watched the X-Men animated series.
That's awesome.
I was really into comics when I was learning how to read it, and
Me too.
ever since.
Yeah, and my story follows your story in a big way because I was a little bit older when I discovered the X-Men animated series, but that really made me way more excited. I started making X-Men comics after I watched that animated series. So I follow the same kind of trajectory as you in a lot of ways, except that like my pops would buy the stuff, but he wasn't a reader, so I couldn't like dig into his boxes.
TV show got animated and then he told me, he got me into comic books. I'm like, oh, there's these characters too. So yeah.
That's awesome, man. Glad to have you, dude.
That's a pretty cool dad.
How about you?
Yeah, my parents, I have a little different story, weren't as gung-ho on the comics thing as Ed's parents were. So I didn't start reading comics until when I was 10 years old. I got a paper route, which meant some of my own income, and I could do whatever I wanted with it. And I started buying comics at that point. Like, I was always drawing, I wasn't reading comics, so I was drawing things like wrestlers that I would see on TV, or like video stores were popular when I was a kid, and like horror movies and slasher movies were popular, so I was drawing like Jason and Freddy and Michael Myers and Leatherface and stuff like that. Very figurative stuff. Once I got hold of a couple of comics, I was like, oh man, this is what I want to do. And it was very similar to what I was already drawing. It was just slightly different characters. So I didn't start reading comics until I was a little bit older, probably 10 or 11 years old. But once I started, I tried to make up for lost time. I was all in from I always say, like, I bought one at a drugstore, and by the time I got home, that was the plan for my life.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, like, in the same breath, as I was a reader of comics before I was able to read the English language, I was kind of a maker of comics at the same time. You know, like, I've been making comics as far as I can remember, and it sounds like once you discover comics, it was the same deal. What did you draw before you started making comics?
A lot of wrestlers, a lot of Hulk Hogan's in my notebooks.
Yeah.
I went through a small phase where I was drawing bulldogs as well for, I'm not sure why, inexplicably. But
Did you like Johnny Quest or something?
I like the British Bulldogs.
Yeah.
I like Matilda. So, yeah, that's the oldest drawing that I have. Well, the oldest drawing is dinosaurs. I don't have a lot of my childhood drawings, so I have a couple probably from whenever I was younger than 12, and one is dinosaurs, one is like fish, like whales and sharks instead. It's like a big, with Crayola markers and
That's
colors
awesome.
and stuff. And then and one is a bulldog.
I think a few of those need to show up on the Cartoonist Kayfabe Instagram, Jimmy.
That could be arranged.
Saw a couple other hands in the back.
Two-part question.
Yes.
For you, music scenes are notoriously insulated. They don't like when people come in or whatever. How was it when you did the hip hop comments? Did you get any have hip hoppers like singers, rappers, whatever you want to call them nowadays, come to you and be like, "That's awesome," or was it like, "Who are you? Why are you in our scene?" Also, second question: why do you guys hate early '90s Valiant so much?
That's going to be a fun one. So for the microphone, the question was the insular nature of music scenes. They're not too keen on welcoming in outsiders. So the Hip Hop Family Tree comic that I put together, did I receive static or negative feedback regarding my comic? And the answer is simply I didn't. I grew up in a hip hop environment to start. So like, I'm not a culture vulture in that sense where, I have my own beefs with a lot of people in comics who I could tell are just like in a careerist fashion, saying like, oh, if I explore this idea, I will probably be able to sell a lot of books. And then they move off of that and then just like glom on to, culture vulture, some other kind of thing that they could probably make a lot of money off of. I live this shit. And I think it comes through the work. And I've never received any negative feedback from anybody in the hip hop community. If it ever comes my way, it's usually it's usually like some professorial, like white liberal person who is like, why are you making comics with a black person? And it's like, get the fuck out of here, man. Who are you? Apologies for the young people. I just speaking.
Wu-Tang's for the kids, right? All that.
Yeah, Wu-Tang is for the children, as the great ODB said. Never had an issue with that. Well, that's not true. There was one guy, I drew him smoking crack because he said he was smoking crack, and just the visceral reaction of seeing that on a printed page, even though the guy did an interview in the New York Times talking about smoking crack, just to see it in the it hurt the dude's feelings. So it wasn't untrue, but to draw it and put it out there hurt the dude's feelings. Second part of the question, and this has come up in conversation fairly recently even, was why do we rag and cut promos on 1990s Valiant Comics?
And let me describe it for anyone unfamiliar with 1990s Valiant Comics. When we talk about the 90s speculator bubble, there are two big companies from that era that really kind of top the charts at that time period. One is Image Comics, which is a bunch of popular Marvel comics who decided they wanted to own their own characters. So they leave Marvel, like X-Men and Spider-Man. They start their own company, Image Comics. It does gangbusters, has lots of ups and downs, as you might expect a bunch of artists running a company would. And then the other company is Valiant Comics. Valiant Comics, what happened is Jim Shooter was editor-in-chief at Marvel for about 10 years into the 80s. Wasn't the most beloved guy, gets ousted from Marvel and starts another company, and that's Valiant. And I often describe Valiant and Image as like the alpha and omega of 80s Marvel comics, because Jim Shooter had a very rigid idea of what comics should be. He was often known to have rules about, some were very good, like every comic is some reader's first comic, so they should be accessible. I like that rule. Other rules weren't as well loved because it was very rigid in its storytelling, and I like these artists who were like going out and doing outrageous stuff.
I would say that these Image guys, like when Jim Shooter goes away in the mid-90s, it left room,
Mid-80s.
Mid-80s, it left room open to like a young Todd McFarlane who was working on Incredible Hulk and then Amazing Spider-Man. It left room open for Jim Lee, who was working on X-Men, Rob Liefeld on New Mutants. They didn't have the rigidity of the Jim Shooter rule set, which was like very rigid squares to put each image into so that it clearly flowed. Like they betrayed all of that old stuff, and it was very exciting to look at on the racks, which created a big audience like for these artists specifically.
And I don't want this to sound like I don't like Jim Shooter, because a lot of my favorite comics came out of his tenure.
He did great work.
Yeah, so
within his constraints.
he goes and starts Valiant, and we talk about like all the money that pours into comics in the early 90s in the speculator era, and he would partner with these businessmen who saw potential of, we could build these characters, IP, sell them, valuable. Jim Shooter was on the creative side of Valiant for the first several years, and for the first year or so when they were actually publishing the comics that we rag on. And they're pretty good. He invents some characters, he licensed some characters, he creates a universe where all these characters coexist, brings in some interesting artists, some new artists, some veteran artists, really good stuff, very exciting. And then after a year or so, whenever the company's kind of at its peak, the businessmen kick him to the curb. And it becomes the height of the speculator-driven comics are these comics. And they would do things like Wizard Magazine would write about them and say, you can't afford not to buy 20 of every new Valiant comic. Meanwhile, the guys who were writing those columns were also selling advertising in the same issue, often on the facing page, that said, hey, you can buy those early Valiant comics at this nice markup from us. They did not make those names publicly known, but whenever you research it now, that's what you find. And the whole magazine is kind of infused with this like weird, you could never get away with this like in stocks or something where they would be investigated and found out. But in comics, it's kind of small potatoes, you get away with this. As Ed said, it's a bunch of people with money trying to separate kids from their money. And Valiant was the most egregious example of this stuff. Certainly not the only ones, but they were kind of the most successful at this time. And as we've gone back through their history, they're remembered as kind of this quality comics publisher, but it's a very small period of time when I think their comics were of quality. And most of the time, now that we've like unpacked it, chronologically at this point, you realize like most of the time it's just them trying to sell product, which I guess it's a commercial industry, but from a reader standpoint, they are not good books. So that's why we're ragging on them.
You know what?
Yes.
It actually kind of corresponds with the first part of your question about like me being involved in hip hop and like were there weird issues there, because these business guys that brought in Jim Shooter, they are culture vultures. Like the stuff that they were talking about in interviews that they thought would appeal to like the young readership. It's a guy from like the music industry who is putting some of his capital up to like make this thing happen. And his big innovation to bringing in new readership is he's going to have Dickie Betts and Aerosmith make special appearances in their comic. That's corny. You know what I'm saying? That's real corny. And then with the Valiant thing in mind, like everything that Jim said about the articles and all that, one of those articles was written by a guy who bought half the print run of some of those number ones, and then he's talking about how you need to buy 100 of them, and he has half the print run in his coffers, kind of like the De Beers Diamonds kind of Monopoly thing.
So greasy.
And there's a price guide in this magazine that's telling you that it's now worth $40. You know what I mean? So they were just running all kinds of game on people, man. In comics, in the States, even an industry that is dealing with margins of capital of like $500 million, it's still small enough to the American, like sort of the eyeballs of the government, that they're not going to have like an SEC that's going to like be probing and doing that sort of insider trading kind of things to kind of keep the playing field even. It's sort of what created the speculator boom in comics, because before that, the adults ruined the sports card game, you know, where little kids had their Michael Jordan rookie card, and that would be worth some, or like Wayne Gretzky. In fact,
Well done.
In those old, it made me think of in those old price guides, the sportsbook price guides, the hockey cards that were worth the most were a company called O-Pee-Chee, because it was a Canadian brand that like rarely came down to the States. So if you had like the O-Pee-Chee Wayne Gretzky rookie card, man, you might be able to pay, well, in America, you might be able to pay like 1/5 of your tuition for 1 year of college, but it's a lot of money.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's a nice pull.
Peter Parker, man, you had your hand up 2 times, dude.
I'd like to state that the aforementioned neck breakage occurred in issue 121 of ASM. Thematically relevant question. Obviously, Jim Shooter actually cared about what he did, although he wasn't popular with creators like, in particular, Mark Wolfman. So your issue isn't actually with books like Bloodshot or Magnus or Dr. Soul or anything like that. It's purely with the company and its ethics.
I think a lot of those comics aren't very good.
So you know, Magnus was fine.
Hey, here's the other thing too. What the Image guys kind of brought to the table was this idea of well, put it this way, they didn't bring this to the table, but they were creators who made a thing that was very successful, and they prospered from their creation. To use a gross term, they prospered from their intellectual property, and it was a big step forward for comics, for the health of comics, and for where sort of things were going. The only other books you could point to before that would have been these amazing outliers, like a Cerebus that was an outlier in self-publishing, or even like an ElfQuest. And then after that, the big one would be Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. That was like still unsurpassed, probably, in terms of the success that brought to the game. So it created this new conversation where there's all these people coming into comics and buying it for whatever reasons, but they are buying it, and the individual is prospering. And then Valiant was like this, like old guard logic, this old logic, where they're going to manufacture a universe which has never happened successfully in comics. If you read every Marvel comic, which I have done up to a point, you will find out that when Fantastic Four is introduced, that's sort of all there is. It's Fantastic Four, which is an evolution of the monster comics that Atlas did of like the 1950s. It's an evolution of that, and then comes like Hulk, and then comes Thor, and then it takes a while for the merger of these different series to even happen.
Right.
And it happens naturally, and they keep introducing these ideas, but it still is just this natural evolution of this old model of like the first Fantastic Fours. They would be denoted in chapters, because the idea of doing a full-length story was even an innovation. So like with the Image stuff, to me it was like a new chapter in the trajectory of like comics success.
Yeah, I used to say, and we'll get right back to this,
Yeah.
but I used to say, like, my dream when I was a kid was I wanted to grow up and draw comics. I wanted to draw Wolverine, Spider-Man, stuff like this. When Image comes along, my dream changes, and it's I want to grow up and draw my own characters and invent my own characters and stories. So, that's what Image kind of represented to me, as a reader, as an aspiring cartoonist at that time.
Yeah, so like the Valiant model was to create this new universe and try to like replicate Jim Shooter's success that he had in the late 70s, early 80s with all the work that he did, because he did amazing work. Like, even though he had a rigidity of format, the people who abided by that prospered from that. Frank Miller prospered from that. John Byrne prospered from that. Valiant stuff, it just rang false. It was manufactured in a way that just didn't do anything for me.
And you can imagine, as we're sitting here talking about, being creators and artists and writers and making our own stuff, one of the Valiant articles in particular in Wizard was by these, like, the executives of the company, talking about how they would sit in on a story meeting or whatever, and they would contribute an idea, and it was it was nothing. It was ludicrous. It would be a reference to some old story or something.
Methuselah, to be
Yes,
specific.
Methuselah.
Continue.
And then, like, as if they were part of this creative process, and then they would talk about their artists and writers. I remember they were talking about Bob Layton, who wrote a lot of comics for them and drew some of their comics, working like 16-hour days there, and it just felt extremely disrespectful, while the same conversation is being had about creators' rights and that the creators should be compensated fairly. You had this executive talking basically about how unimportant the creator was, even though they're breaking themselves, doing the hard work of the book. To the executive, at least in this interview, it's the same as him walking in and saying Methuselah and walking out and going and having his executive benefits. So
now go spend a month
Yes.
of your time and go make that. But it's co-created by me, and never forget that.
So
Get the F out of here.
some of it is definitely driven by these personalities that would emerge at the time, and they would rub me wrong personally, and I'd just be like, yeah, maybe I am biased against it going into that issue of Solar or something, but I still say those comics aren't great.
Big fan of grand design. Can you talk a little bit about the process of putting that together? And is there things that you really want to put in that you just didn't have room for?
So the question was about my process of putting together X-Men Grand Design, and what are there some things that I wasn't able to get in there and that I regret. And just real quick to explain what X-Men Grand Design was, I'm a big X-Men fan, and the comics that I'm a fan of were written by this guy named Chris Claremont, who very uniquely in Work for Hire Comics was able to maintain the position of writer on that series for almost like 17 years, which is very rare. Usually they'll get their 12-issue, 1-year run and move on to something else. But he was really able to fashion a universe here and be very creative and take the series places. But there was like all this stuff that happened before that he had to try to wedge in that really didn't quite work. But then he did not own X-Men, and Jim Shooter specifically had certain mandates that were thrust upon him. So when his story was going this way, for instance, the character of Jean Grey, Phoenix, is dead, and he had every intention of having her stay dead. But then Jim Shooter hears from the old guard that we'll probably sell a lot more comics if we bring back the old X-Men, which includes Jean Grey. So now Chris Claremont's going this direction, but now he has the editorial mandate to like bring back this character. Now he has to like come up with some Deus Ex Machina way to make that happen. And it reads very clunkily. So my comic, X-Men Grand Design, was designed to just try to take all of that material, which is about 8,000 pages of comics, and create a simple 240-page story, kind of chronicle of the X-Men. And that's what I did. But you can imagine 8,000 pages down to 240. Some stuff has to hit the cutting room floor. There's not too much that I regret because I knew what my constraints were, and I made sure to get everything I wanted in there. The reason I did the thing was because I put a tweet out into the universe and said, Marvel should let me make whatever I want. They said, well, what do you want to do? And my idea was everything. I want to do all the X-Men stuff I want to do. And that's what this is, very self-indulgent. And people would call me out online, like if you look at Amazon reviews and stuff, so what? We're just looking at Ed playing some sort of editorial like tricks again. And it's like, yes, that is what you're getting. If you're into that, buy it. And if not, stick with your old comics. I could give a shit. I still have an ivory back scratcher at the house. So no real regrets, but like the parameters for creating that to me as a student of comics, it's like I'm looking at older stuff that was able to accomplish a lot of story, and one of those things would be like Hal Foster's Prince Valiant, where to me that's like the definition of epic. That word is really abused these days, but it's like, that's an epic comic, and you have to get a lot in there. So it's like I'm playing around with the format of that, using old storytelling techniques, like with Hergé's Tintin even. But then there's this creator named Fletcher Hanks, who was creator of comics in the golden age, and maybe only did like 70 pages of comics, 100 pages of comics, and it's like real whimsical, wild stuff that you wouldn't think would work, and it actually doesn't work, but it's still fun to watch him try. And that's how X-Men reads. If you take away all of the soap operas, all the character stuff, take away all of that, which is not the stuff I was into as a little dude, and then distill it down, and you get this like weird romp that is unbelievable that Marvel, paid me to become a better cartoonist to make and put under their umbrella. But listen, I have my charms, as you guys have seen right here.
I was thinking of asking Ed if you had any non-comics influences when it came to putting together Cartoonist Kayfabe.
You know what? A big inspiration for the channel, with the Wizard magazine stuff in particular, was there's a retro gaming YouTube websites. There was this one called Classic Gaming Quarterly. When you're drawing comics, you need stuff to kind of keep you company. And I don't even know how I found this, man, but it was some dude. Classic Gaming Quarterly is the channel, and he was just doing basically what we're doing with Nintendo Power Magazine. And to see that happen with the issues of Nintendo Power that I had, it gave me that feeling that I had with Wizard when I rediscovered it in those boxes. And when I rediscovered the Wizard magazines in those boxes, I then put together a run of the first 100 within that week, and I just had them collecting dust. And there aren't many people as charismatic as me and Jim in the comic book biz. So I figured if anybody would be able to pull this off with that Classic Gaming Quarterly gimmick format, it would be you and I. So I was able to have that conversation with you on our way to Baltimore Comic-Con last year. We're almost celebrating our year anniversary.
Yeah, that's a weird feeling for me. I feel like we're still at the very beginning of this, and
Yeah.
realize like we're like 10 months in.
Yeah.
It's almost a year, as you say.
We almost have 10,000 subscribers, man. That's not doing too bad. In fact, that Classic Gaming Quarterly guy, he recently hit 100,000 subscribers, and he did like a live Q&A, and he said it took more than 2 years to get 1,000. So I would say we're on a good track.
That's very hopeful.
Mm-hmm. It just takes one viral thing. That's why you have to do these show and tells and like show off weird stuff, because it just takes one. And this is like a lesson to anybody who out here who's creative, who's putting things online, who's sharing comics, art, whatever. You do one thing. You do your Robert Crumb's Keep on Trucking, probably maybe the first instance in comics of like a truly like viral image that was appropriated by the wider culture, and then you now have 10,000 followers or something. You know what I mean? That's all it takes, and I'm sure that's what he did one video that really caught on, and then that brings in a certain critical mass that you could then build on top of. Are you bringing anything to the table that comes from outside of comics?
Yeah, definitely. As you say, drawing comics is kind of a long process. You do need stuff to listen to just maintain your sanity. I got into podcasting very early on for that reason, and what happens is whatever I'm watching, reading, doing, pretty soon I want to know how that's made.
Right.
And the way you learn that is by doing it yourself. I had a podcast for a couple of years called Tell Me Something I Don't Know, where I would interview guests, and it was because I had listened to so many podcasts and just wanted to be like, well, let's see how this is done, and it was very enjoyable. But some of the non-comics influences for Cartoonist Kayfabe, I watch lots of stuff. We trade stuff all the time. There's some wrestlers called Young Bucks that started chronicling. They were independent wrestlers. They would travel around the world wrestling outside of like WWE, which was sort of the one wrestling entity for the last 15 years or so. They've been kind of like the only mainstream wrestling. So these guys just started documenting their travels and experiences on a YouTube show called Being the Elite. And now that they're a wrestling company at this point, because they built up these followers, they were able to kind of share their experiences. And I like that idea. I like being able to make comics about the subject you're interested in and share that. Talk about the subjects that you're interested in. And, we've had a lot of positive experience from putting our work online, from, social media outlets, things like this, where it really allows you to find people who share your interests. And that was something that I really started to see with these YouTubers and with these wrestlers in particular, because they weren't doing anything out of the ordinary in terms of wrestling. You know, it was exactly what wrestling history has always been, and yet that ability to connect almost directly with their fans allowed them to just be them. And so that really spoke to me. Whenever we started talking about this, you know, I would see a few YouTubers that really seemed like that ability to put out your interests. It's amazing. It's free. It's creatively freeing. It allows you to just go deeper into the thing that you love. And I think that is palpable and transferable, and I think people feed off of that. You know, that's something I often enjoy with whether it's podcasts, movies, you know, TV, whatever. So many artists are creating their own content and then figuring out how to sell that and how to get that out there, that they're not compromising. And that's the stuff that I usually respond to. You can almost sense that enthusiasm, and it's one of my favorite things is that enthusiasm, that energy. I kind of feed off of that. So hopefully we do a little bit of that with this channel.
I always feel jazzed up whenever we're finished recording. You know, we end our little spiels, man, and are like, let's go get back to making comics. I don't know about you, I get back to making comics like
Yes.
that day. It's like we wrap everything up, you know, turn those big ass lights off, put them in the corner, and get back to business, man. But there is a very pragmatic benefit as cartoonists to having this channel, because to make a comic, to make a graphic novel, the paper that I draw on is 11 inches by 17, and it's giant, a lot of pencil mileage, as we say, and it takes me 3 or 4 days to make 1 page of comics, and then you got to multiply that amount of time by
240 pages.
exactly.
What is that, about 1,000 days?
It was like 1,200 days work in a row on X-Men Grand Design. But now I'm in the state of making my own stuff. I was doing all of that work to get to a position where I could have the bills paid while I work on my own comics. The way the culture is today, out of sight, out of mind, man. And it takes so long to make a damn comic. This thing I'm going to work on is going to take me the better part of 1 year. You're tempting fate if you disappear for a year and then put out the thing. So to have this like regular presence, not a bad thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been asked several times about like what I'd like to change about comics.
Yeah.
And one of the answers I often give is I think we need more criticism, more journalism, because comics are, I think, in a golden age right now. There are comics for every interest, every age. You know, whatever you're interested in, you can probably find good comics that will meet you almost perfectly. You know, I think of the Venn diagrams, and like whenever you're a kid and there's 3 channels or whatever, if you're interested in cars, you're watching Dukes of Hazzard and your Venn diagram barely overlaps, you know, because there aren't very many choices. And now today in comics, there's everything. Old classics are all in print and available. When I was a kid and I'd hear some, you know, go read Dick Tracy or Orphan Annie, it was hard to get a volume of that stuff. They would be out of print, they would be expensive, it'd be hard to actually find one, and now all that stuff's available. It really is this amazing golden age, and it's almost like the rest of the support that you need around an industry has not caught up to that. So we have really great material, but it's hard to find. Frequently I'll get a book, someone will recommend a book or give me a book, and I'll love it, and it'll be 2 years old and I've never heard of it. And it's like, I should have known about this 6 months before it was published. I love this. Why did it take so long? And whenever we started this channel, I didn't have a lot of expectations. I was trying to figure out how to navigate the technical part of producing the thing, you know, and notes for Wizard and stuff. But as we've started to get more feedback from everybody, it's one of the things I'm excited about the channel is like, we're adding a little bit to that critical voice. You know, we're highlighting some of the stuff that we find exciting or looking forward to or have read that sounds good. And to me, like, that's something I hope to see more of in comics, is being able to find these titles that are special and find the audiences to connect the two. You know, as Ed says, doing this channel is one way for us to stay in touch with our audience, which is, it's a challenge. It's hard to figure out how you find the audience from the creator point of view. But I think it's could be equally frustrating from the audience point of view of how do you navigate whenever there are so many books out there, many of them very, very strong, but what's the entry point? So that's been one of the things that's come out of this channel that completely unintentional, and I love it, and I hope more of that happens. You know, when we were kids, there were all kinds of magazines besides Wizard, things like Amazing Heroes, the Comics Journal. You know, there were really quality critical publications that would help navigate and separate, like, these are the good books, this is the interesting titles. And we've kind of lost that a little bit. It's almost like so many comics have proliferated. We've interviewed like Gary Groth, publisher of Comics Journal and of Fantagraphics, and his shift has really gone from being very critical to just being publisher. And I think it's a result, these are my words, not his, but I think it's a result of the quality of cartooning that exists now. You know, you can only do so much, and I think that you look around and see all of this great work, you know, it's hard not to keep feeding that, but there's a trade-off. We don't have as much of the critical piece. So I'm hoping to see more of that come back.
What was the name of the Fantagraphics oral history book? Gary Groth and all this. It was We Told You So.
Yes.
Because he created the Comics Journal as this critical forum to talk about what he sort of hoped. He willed the good comics into existence. He put his money where his mouth was and gave Love and Rockets a shot and then expanded from there and all of that stuff. So then it grows, there are better comics, and it's like, all right, man, that's where the division of labor has to go to now. But listen, Jimmy, it is 3:02. We have an hour until the next big panel. So we should hit maybe a couple of the bigger points, open things up to questions, and then, we could probably filibuster for another hour, Cal. So like, we'll leave it up to you to sort of tell us how things should shake out too, man. Cool. Are there any other questions? We could hit some of our other points in a second.
Okay, so Ed, you did X-Men Grand Design. Frequent co-host on the show, or guest on the show, is Tom Scioli. He's doing Fantastic Four Grand Design.
I think I see.
You know where I'm going with this.
Yes, I do.
Jim Rugg Grand Design. What's coming up? What are you doing? Are you going to do something?
Jubilee.
Great question, Dave. And the question is, Ed has done X-Men Grand Design. Tom Scioli, frequent collaborator on the show, is doing Fantastic Four Grand Design. What's my Grand Design? Since Lobo is a DC continuity, I guess that one's off the table.
I'm looking for that DP7. DP7 Grand Design.
I'll tell you what, New Universe Grand Design would be entertaining.
Series, but you could certainly do a one-shot.
Maybe an 8-page Marvel Comics Presents short. There's a lot of characters I'd be interested in. I don't have a grand design in the works at the moment, but it's fun to see what people suggest. And some of my favorite highlights, besides Dazzler, which I feel like's kind of covered in X-Men, falls under that umbrella. 1970s, like the weird characters from Marvel in the 1970s. I did a book called Aphrodisiac that was very influenced by 1970s superhero comics and especially Marvel. There's some really cool comics history that goes with those characters. What happened is Marvel was limited in their distribution deal in the late 60s, like when the Marvel Universe really grows into this like huge fan favorite publisher. They were limited because they were distributed by their rival DC Comics and could only publish so many books a month. Whenever that deal ends, Marvel's very popular and suddenly has a right, they can print as many books as they can sell. And I refer to it as like the inmates running the asylum. And so all kinds of weird stuff comes out in the 70s. Stan Lee goes out west. There's new editors-in-chief, and it's just weird times. So characters like Ghost Rider is probably one of the better ones, but then there's stuff like Son of Satan. Son of Satan was a superhero comic book that was on the racks next to Spider-Man. So I would be tempted to look at some of those like 70s, like supernatural, weird, satanic comics of Marvel. I don't know if there's a big demand for the grand design on that one.
Well, whatever you choose, man, I will happily pass the baton because like my idea for grand designs, it's like let's have like auteur creators like make the damn comic. Let's see what it looks like when a singular vision makes a Marvel comic or a DC comic or whatever, man. Like those are largely bound by time, which requires the assembly line process, which requires massive compromise across the board from the creatives involved. And if you were like a single person making the decision, it's just a far more interesting comic for what I need out of a comic. Like you could enjoy comics for whatever reasons you like, but me personally, I like to see comics made by one person. Even if there's a part of the process that isn't as sharp as the other, you know what I mean? Like I would much prefer reading Sandman by Neil Gaiman only. Like let's see what that looks like.
That'd be very fun.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, that's comics are often compared to things like film and other media. And I always think like, what are the advantages of comics? And one of them is that one person can make a whole comic, like you can really get somebody's vision in a story And there's not a lot of other media that has that power. So it is really cool. And I think that's an aspect of X-Men Grand Design and now Fantastic Four Grand Design that may not be spoken about as much, but it's a really unique way to experience these comics, to have that singular vision. And it hasn't been done at Marvel Comics before. So that is an exciting element. And hopefully I will get a chance at a Grand Design at some point. There are lots of characters at Marvel that I'm very fond of. So we'll see what happens. Who knows what the future holds.
It'll be awesome, that's for sure. If it goes down, man, it's gonna be a beautiful product. Plus, also, that's the Pittsburgh crew, man. Like the Pittsburgh crew doing the Grand Designs. It's a cool idea. We stole your Sidney Crosby, and we'll steal your Marvel Comics.
Keep Justin Bieber.
Well, Pittsburgh ain't claiming Justin Bieber. Just for the camera right here. That's all the other Americans, man.
Any other questions right now?
Was there ever a comic that, like, any like comic series or superhero that made you think, that made you now that I want to be a comic book cartoonist? Any like hero or team?
Yes. The question is, was there a comic book or hero or team that made us want to be cartoonists?
Yeah.
A lot of the Image guys really spoke to me. You know, they were my favorite comics at the time. Whenever Savage Dragon came out, it was Eric Larson who had done a lot of Spider-Man work. He started his own book called Savage Dragon, and it really spoke to me as like an aspiring creator. He was breaking rules. He was doing stuff that you wouldn't see in superhero comics, but it still had like all the stuff I loved in superhero comics. And it felt like, man, this is how to do it. Like he's doing whatever idea he has, ideas that he couldn't have done, you know, at Marvel or DC. And it was really exciting. So like I would get a new issue of Savage Dragon. I'd run home and read it first. You know, I'd have a stack of comics. It would always be the first one. And then afterwards I'd have to draw some stuff, you know, probably copying drawings from Savage Dragon. But it really gave me that energy of like, man, this is exciting stuff. This is what I want to do. But there have been a lot of comics like that. You know, like I used to judge comics. My favorite comics were the ones that made me want to draw afterwards. Another one that really stood out was Frank Miller did a comic book called Sin City. And Frank Miller was one of the first artists that I was really inspired by and followed his work. And he was away from comics whenever I got into comics. He was in Hollywood writing RoboCop 2 and I don't know about anything else. And he came back to comics in the early 90s, and one of the first things he did was Sin City, which was black and white, very unusual. You know, most of the comics I read at the time were color. He was lettering it himself, and the lettering looked a little bit weird, but it was still like an amazing comic book to read. And that was another one that like inspired me to think it doesn't have to look a certain way. You know, like as long as it's legible or whatever, like you could letter it yourself. You could, you know, it could be in black and white, and that one was a big one for me.
You earlier you asked about how old were we when we got into comics, and I described that I was reading comics before I could read the written language and just follow the pictures around. Early on, when I was able to learn how to read words, I still remember having a profound experience when I opened up an X-Men comic and was able to read the credits box in that comic and read, this comic was written by Chris Claremont, this comic was penciled by John Byrne, this comic was inked by Terry Austin, and the fact of seeing names associated with the work that was done in the comic let me know that these are not stamped out by a machine or something, like human beings. Somebody like as old as my dad could have just made this comic. Like my dad could have that job. It's like, forget about it. I'm not going to grow up to be a poet.
People signed it.
Yeah.
Not some machine.
Exactly. They made it by themselves with the human hands, you know? And that was it. Like,
Not some freaky robot.
I wasn't going to grow up to be a policeman or an astronaut or any of that. It's like comics, you know, that's what I want to do. On top of the things that Jim described as being influences, I have to say, man, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle comics. It's like, you know the cartoon when you're a little kid, and then you see like the blue and the purple and the orange and whatever the other color is. And then you see the NES, the Nintendo cartridge, with all the turtles having the red bandanas, and you're like, well, that looks wrong. And then you see some more of those turtles with all the reds, and it's like, what is going on here? And then you discover the origin of this huge, gigantic toy line cartoon series, video games, his franchise started off as a comic. And then not only was it a comic, but it was very crude. Like when you look at, there is almost like an agreed upon standard of what these Marvel and DC comics would be considered professional. And this stuff looks really kind of hard to do. Like, I don't know how you feel, man, but when I take a look at these comics, certainly when I was around your age, I had a lot of work to do to get to that level. But I don't know if you've seen the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle comics, they're not as rigorous. Like, you'll be able to draw like that Ninja Turtle stuff before you be able to draw like this. So that passed a few barriers for me that make me feel like, well, I don't have to get to this level to make a comic. I just have to be as good as as Eastman and Laird, the guys who created Ninja Turtles.
If you could make a teenage mutant turtle or a giant rat, you could probably make a human being.
Maybe. Maybe, man. The jury's still out with those guys. See your hand way back?
Hey, I was gonna ask, when I was younger, I was able to buy a lot of the Bronze Age comic books, the Silver Age comic books, and even Golden Age for pretty cheap at that point.
Yeah.
We're gotten to this point where I've noticed that kids nowadays, they can't afford a lot of the big, they can afford the collected works, but it's not like owning that issue, you know, like opening the record and smelling and stuff like that.
You're right.
What are your guys' opinions of that? Like, that kids now, some kids nowadays will never be able to read maybe the Iron, like, X-Men run because they can't afford it. Or, like, even Spider-Man #1 is beyond most people's, you know, like, it's, what do you think of collectors pricing the books out of range for who they were intended for?
So first, the question is, a lot of old comics, valuable comics, collector's items are out of the price range of, say, new readers or kids. How do we feel about that? This is a great question. I'm glad you asked it. There's a lot of ways people interact with comics now, and I think that's really healthy for comics as a whole. Collectors, I don't consider myself a collector, even though I have lots of comics. I don't have them in bags and boards. Like, they're pretty much everything I have is a reading copy, and they're beat up. It's what you see on this table, essentially. And that stuff is affordable, you know. It's nice that it's all reprinted. Like, when I was a kid, you would hear about certain comics, Jack Kirby Fantastic Four, for example, you know, the early Marvel comics. They were out of my price range back then, too, but they weren't easily accessible in reprints. Even the reprints were out of my price range at the time. So it's awesome that the reprints are available now. You know, it's pretty ubiquitous if your tastes go in that direction. I'm not somebody that thinks if you're a comics fan, you need to read this history. I would like to see like a comics canon established, just to kind of have language, you know, that if you are a serious comic reader, scholar, creator, whatever, we could all, you know, have some common ground to talk about them. But I think it's okay, you know, like I'm okay that there's a group of people that like comics as collector's items. Awesome, stick around, because they were here when I was a kid. And you know, some readers will grow into that group. And I mean, you know, I don't know, I love those old comics. They're my favorite format for comics, but I don't know that there's an inherent quality that like new readers need them. You know, the what I would say for like young readers and new readers and kid readers, when we were reading comics, when we started in the 90s, so much attention was given to like, comics aren't for kids anymore. And it seemed like that's where a lot of money was driven, to things like Frank Miller's Dark Knight Returns and Watchmen, and then the Image stuff was like violent R-rated superheroes, which I loved, but was not all ages friendly. And there's like a decade where, you know, we lose a generation of readers because there weren't really comics aimed at this group. And now that's become a big push with publishers. One, because it's selling, you know, I mean, these publishers aren't doing it out of the goodness of their heart. They have numbers that like, that's a very big growing audience. And part of it is because they're in libraries, you know, and kids are finding them. So I'm very excited by that part. That's another one of those opposite of doom and gloom in my mind, is like seeing in the last 5 years or so the attention to all ages comics and bringing this new generation online with comics. I think that's awesome. It's very different than those collectors that you talk about, but I don't know that that's a bad thing. I mean, I think if there's lots of entry points to comics, inevitably, we're all going to interact with these comics differently, but definitely that's a healthy thing for the future of the comics. So some trade-offs, but also some good some positives, I think, in there.
Yeah, the sort of fandom around comics, it's like adapt or die, like some of those older comics, there are just becoming like less and less of them, and I guess the ones that are extremely valuable that are known, like that's all there is. So there aren't going to be more, and there may potentially be more interest, and that's going to drive the price up on those things. But I don't know about you, Jimmy. I never spent more than I think $8 on a back issue before in my life, and that was when I was even like a little kid. I'm just not into that. Like I'm not like looking to fill in gaps in my collection or whatever. Like things come my way. We make on the Cartoonist Kayfabe channel, I think we have no less than 4 or 5 videos that are an hour's long length of us just digging through quarter bins and like showing you guys like what we got from the 25-cent bin at some local retailer or whatever.
We're going to do that episode on Radioactive Black Belt Hamsters. I'm just saying.
He asked the question, when are we going to do the episode on the Radioactive Black Belt Hamsters, which was a 1986 thing that happened after Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles gained popularity. Culture vultures, as we described earlier, got into the game and thought, like, it's not the charm and the sort of craft of Eastman and Laird's Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles that helped it achieve the status that it did or hit like the zeitgeist in the way that it did. It's having like an anthropomorphic animal title that hits iambic pentameter with some sort of cultural appropriation when it comes to some ninja, samurai, penguin, killer koala. And there's a lot of that stuff, man. Like there's might be 20 or 30 series of these different things. And when we dig through those quarter bins, I always find one I've never heard of before. And I always get it. And I don't have everything in order, but I do have those all together. And they're long way saying there probably will be an episode
Yes.
where we unpack all of the anthropomorphic animal ninja teams of 1986.
Yeah, 1986 is a comic book year. 1986 and 1993 are like my 2 favorite years in comic book history. 1986 is what's known as the black and white boom that comes out of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles success. What happened is those guys made not just a successful comic, but they made a black and white successful comic, and black and white is very, very cheap to produce. And so everybody saw that and was like, we can make these comics with almost no overhead, no risk, no know-how. And the result is, you still need a little bit of time to ramp up, but by 1986, it's like the apex of all of these people just making black and white books and shoving them out into the market. And it's bizarre, to say the least, and a lot of fun comics, and some very good ones. But there's a preview issue. Amazing Heroes was a comics magazine at the time. They would do like season previews of what's coming out in the second half of 1986, and there are 13 of those Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle knockoffs just in that 6-month gap. So
I'm sure I have them all too.
Yeah. So we had a question. Were there any childhood heroes that we grew up to work on? Ed, obviously, I think X-Men was a book that.
Now, it's a question in terms of creators.
In terms of creators from,
Right.
from your childhood that you guys would work with.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Like from day one, my first published work was with the great writer Harvey Pekar of American Splendor fame. He's a writer that was a hero of mine. In that same volume appeared a strip that was drawn by Robert Crumb, who is a hero of mine. In the X-Men Grand Design trades, I recolor some favorite X-Men comics that I dug over the years. So I got to color Jack Kirby. I got to color Art Adams. I got to color Todd McFarlane. Got to color Jim Lee, Dave Cockrum, and just this past week, a variant cover I drew for Rob Liefeld's Major X Zero hit the stands, man. So I got to work with a lot of people, and on top of that, I got to sort of get to know many other of my heroes and stuff like just casually, man. So that was like not something I was even expecting getting into the game, but it's been a cool kind of thing that just happened along the way. How about you, Jim?
I don't have nearly that kind of answer, Ed. You definitely work with more heroes in comics than I have. I did a fill-in issue for iZombie, which was a Mike Allred book. And before that, whenever the economy tanked in 2008, I quit my job in 2007 to do this full-time. In 2008, the economy kind of cratered, and I had 2 one-year contracts that were cut short, and I did not have a kill fee written into the contract. So I was sitting at home suddenly with no prospects and thinking about other lines of work. And Mike Allred contacted me about sort of an in-between. He connected me to a book that I ended up drawing called One Model Nation with Courtney Taylor and a musician, and it's about a musical band in Germany in the 70s. And so Mike Allred connected me to that job, even though I didn't work with him directly on it.
There's one hero we didn't get to work with yet, man. And we have this comic right here, Big Numbers. Number 1, Bill Sienkiewicz. It's long unfinished. Only 2 issues came out, and it was intended to be 12 issues, as you can see on the back right there, man. And Alan Moore, the writer, just recently put almost a press release out there saying that he retired from comics and that this work is going to go unfinished. But we're here to tell Alan Moore that his career is not over. We are here for the job. I am speaking for Jim, so you could bow out if you want, man. But we're here. We're ready to draw Big Numbers 3 through 12.
Yeah, and I will add, Alan, you just got to accept it's not quite going to look like Bill Sienkiewicz's version, but we'll do our best.
Yeah. We'll do a little woodshedding ahead of time, man. Now we sort of cut that promo before on the channel, and somebody out there in the comments on YouTube mentioned that there was a book that published Alan Moore's notes regarding Big Numbers, and it's like I took some scans and I posted it up on the Cartoonist Kayfabe Instagram, and it's like, a piece of regular paper like this, two sheets in fact, and there are like 40 characters or something,
at least,
and little sentences about what happens to each character throughout every issue. And it is impossible to read. It's so small, but it's like all figured out. But it's amazing. It's like, truthfully, Big Numbers doesn't have to be finished in any major way because it's like all there in those crazy notes, man. That's another big benefit of like what's been happening with the channel, because like the video is not the only thing. I think one of the charms of the videos or whatever is the fact that we don't perpetrate the fraud, man. And if there's something we don't know, we're just like, yeah, I don't know. Can somebody in the comments illuminate us on this matter? And 100% of the time it goes down that way, man. So it's like, yeah, watch the video, but then you got to check those comments because things get expanded upon in like very, very rich ways.
That's one of my favorite parts of the channel. Is like you say, Ed, there's so much that we don't know, but I don't think we have any questions that have gone unanswered. We may not know them, but man, you're right. The community around it has really become like this super comic book store. It's what I loved about comic book stores when I first found them, and it's kind of like we've built this audience that's between all of us. We have most of the answers.
Yeah, and furthermore, beyond that, like we don't abuse the privilege, man. But sometimes there might be a hole or a gap in the collection or whatever. And for instance, you might want, and I've always lusted after like an Elektra Assassin poster that just shows up in the mail. And
all thanks to Dave.
Yeah,
thank you.
That's awesome, man.
It is. I had a hole on my wall that has now been filled.
And in your heart.
Yes.
It's kind of like crowdsourcing, because you're able to get the info that way. Like the comment section on Kayfabe is largely positive, or even if it's a negative comment, it's about the issue itself. It's not the usual YouTube comments that you see around.
I can't suffer fools, man. I can't keep that kind of shit in my life. Apologies for the swear words again.
Sorry to interrupt. You mentioned you got to work with Harvey Pekar.
Yes.
And then you went on. How did that come about?
Question, how did I have the chance to work with Harvey Pekar? And I just celebrated 37th birthday, and so I was in a retrospective moment, like just trying to figure out like how did all this even happen, like this point in time right now. And the sort of major thing that happened was like age 21, I got myself in the black from all of my student loan debt, and I quit my job in August. I worked in a haunted house in town from September to October. In October, I got a call from Harvey Pekar because when I quit my job in August, I immediately began drawing my own strips. A 5-pager here, a 4-pager there. And in like 2003, there were anthologies out there. Every small publisher had one. And I sent strips to every single one of those publishers, systematically got rejected by every single one. It's not good enough, and they were right. It wasn't good enough. My writing was lacking. My entire young life, I was far leaning towards the art part of comics than the total creation of the thing. So the writing needed work, no doubt. I put so much work into those comics, I didn't want to just throw them away. I needed to repurpose them and do something with them because it would have really hurt my psyche if I would just like do all that work, throw it in the trash. Started making mini comics. Sent the stuff to cartoonists who I dug a lot. This is before social media, when you had to like go into the back of the comic and hit the letters page and see where you could send correspondence and letters. There was a Dark Horse. American Splendor comic, and the cover was designed like a Time magazine Man of the Year cover, and had a photograph of Harvey Pekar right here. And then you know how when you would have a subscription to a magazine, there would be like laser printed, your address would be here? It said Harvey Pekar, P.O. Box, blah, 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 like an address. It looked like a legit address, and I sent comics to that address that were not sent back to me, return to sender or anything like that. They were going somewhere. The movie comes out, American Splendor, played by Paul Giamatti, the guy who played Pig Vomit in the Howard Stern flick. And I get a call the week after I see the American Splendor movie from Harvey Pekar. Thought it was a kid who was just like a homeboy that was just playing a trick on me. It wasn't, it was really Harv, and it just like went from there. He was his most popular at that moment and taking every offer. But he needed artists to kind of fill the role. And you always hear that term, it's a cliche, right place, right time. It sounds insurmountable when you hear that, and it sounds like, like stars have to be in alignment. If you guys are creators, I'm not sure who's a creator out here in this room, the thing that I've discovered is there are many, many, many right places, many, many right times. And that was just one that got me in the door. And as a young creator, young comic book maker, my thoughts were always like, just give me a shot. Like you give me a shot, I will never leave. Like I will be in it forever. I just need that one chance. And the American Splendor stuff, the crudity of much of the artwork, it made me feel like, well, I could draw better than these dudes. Forget that. But then the realities of actually making comics, Harv hit me up and he's like, yeah, man, do you want to do 28 pages in like 20 days? And I'm like, yes, sir, I do. And the realities of that yielded artwork that couldn't match the other artists in his book who were working under the same conditions, and made me respect a lot of like what I see on the page, where it's just like, okay, man, I don't know what homeboy was going through in order to like do that or whatever, man. But he gave me that shot, and it was like I'm one of the rare people who was able to like make money in comics from day one. Because he had a page rate, and it was like, here's a 4-pager, here's a 28-pager, here's a 150-pager, here's a 120-pager, and that's like my first like seed money to put into my own comics. Yes?
I was wondering what you thought about the relationship between comics and manga. Because like in film, for example, you have Japanese films, you have English films, they're all films. But in comic, they're like treated as like manga or comic, and people look like either, they're the exact same medium, they're kind of separated.
You hit the nail on the head. Yeah.
Question is how we feel about the differences between manga and I guess American comics. Film, for example, is not really considered like, Japanese film versus American film as two separate things, but for some reason in North America, comics are kind of separated as if manga and American comics are a different medium.
It feels like there could be beneficial influence.
How do you feel about it? Because to me, it's comics by another name. Like the Japanese name for a car is still a car, and that's all it is for me. You know what I mean? Like, I guess it's a marketing term, or the way that we use it in the States.
It probably is a marketing term, the same way like graphic novel that's a marketing term. It means your book has a spine. You know, unfortunately, it doesn't denote the contents in any way. It's just your book has a spine is what graphic novel is. And so manga probably is mostly viewed here or applied here as a marketing term. I'm with Ed. Like, I read lots of comics, and I don't really distinguish it's comics or comics. I love manga. I've been reading more and more of it. It's very influential on the next book that I'm working on right now. And I don't know that there's any hard and fast obvious differences. You know, it might look very different than like the monthly issue of Spider-Man that just came out, but I think if you start looking at the shelf of graphic novels and, you know, a variety of comic books and a variety of manga, you'll see things that overlap. Like, it would be very hard to distinguish them as you start looking at sort of the broad landscape of what is available today in a good comic book shop. So I don't know, I don't see it as much. I remember whenever we hit a spot in Wizard Magazine where the editor of Wizard Magazine declares in an editorial, I will never read manga. So that distinction definitely existed in the early days of like imports and translated manga, but I don't feel it as much anymore. You know, I guess some readers maybe still, that's their reaction. But I don't know, like personally it's been a while since I've had this like, oh, that's manga, so I can't read that, or I don't understand it, or it's different. I don't know. Is that something that people still feel strongly? Are there still divisions amongst readers in that way?
Not so much. We sometimes do still hear from people saying, and it's just terminology. They'll say, I don't read comics, but I do read manga. And usually, I think what they mean is they just read them in the volumes rather than single issues.
That makes sense. It's interesting to me the history of whenever manga started coming into the United States and how they would try to play with different formats and figure out, like, how do we package a 7,000-page story to people that are used to buying 20 pages a month?
Pretty wise, some of the things that they did, now that I think about it, because it's like, okay, we'll bring in Lone Wolf and Cub, which has the violence that Americans like, but then we'll have that Frank Miller cover, and then there would be like with Viz or Eclipse, there would be, say, Appleseed, and that was something that Art Adams was down with, and like you get this mainstream like Marvel guy to like do some covers, and that will at least buy 10 seconds of the reader's time. Or like the guy at the comic shop, like oh, that's a nice Art Adams thing, and then maybe they'll look into it. So they did a lot of things. Maybe.
Yeah, definitely. There's a lot of great, like from a creative point of view, there's so much great storytelling. The model for making manga is very different than the American model, and as a result, the storytelling's a little bit different. I find that really fascinating. Ed and I are both kind of in the early stages of our next graphic novels, and I think about manga a lot. There are a few series that look at the way manga storytelling is developed, like Bakumen is about like two young kids that want to be manga artists, and it's a really great story because they get hooked up with an editor, which is very influential in manga, and the editor sort of talks them through their story and says, well, you need to have a love interest, or you need to have a B story, you know, like, and it's foundationally sound. It's very interesting to see the thought process of like what makes a story work. And those stories are typically serialized in weekly or bi-weekly in chunks of like 20 pages, give or take a little bit. And so adjustments are made. You know, they're surveying like what series are readers responding to, what are they responding to. So a lot of times, like popular manga, you'll see maybe they'll veer 3 or 4 chapters in because this character is the one that readers are really responding to, or this storyline's the one that readers are responding to. And I find that really interesting. We did a book club where we read Akira, which is one of the more popular mangas that have come to America. It's amazing, it's an epic, it's by a master cartoonist. But as you read through it, you start to see some differences, and you can see like things are set up that maybe aren't revisited, and it's probably due to the nature of serialization. So, you know, there are definitely some differences, but I think you would find some differences in Japanese film versus American film too, or any film, you know, industry around the world is going to have some storytelling differences.
It's cultural, like it's a cultural idiom that is inflecting itself upon the medium, and that is awesome. And as a creator, to like cut yourself off from any of that is really doing yourself a disservice. And if you, me, Tom, like the Pittsburgh crew, if we share anything when it comes to comics, it's the fact that we will look at all of it, down to, you know, Outcult's Yellow Kid, to you know, some avant-garde goofball stuff of the past 10, 15 years.
One of the great things with manga too is like it's such a big industry. Like you can find manga about any subject. Like there aren't a lot of American comics about cooking or about sports, and like you can find all of this stuff in very exciting stories. So I love that part of manga as a reader. It's very inspiring too, because like I want to make comics that aren't like all the other comics that I see, and that means getting into genres that aren't popular in American comics possibly, or covering subject matter that I don't see other comics covering. But I can look at a lot of manga as like an example, and I mean, like, think of the popularity. They have cooking mangas that sell 100 million copies. Like it's dazzling, it's exciting. They figure out how to make a scene of like a plate of food dynamic and interesting. So I personally, there's a lot I learn and take and kind of study that stuff, but it's very entertaining storytelling, especially if you find subject matter that you're interested in. Very exciting. I've been reading sports mangas lately, and they've become sort of my favorite at the moment. One
of the things that I like most about the fact that the Japanese market for comics is so gigantic is that the possibility for there being manga about kind of like making manga or mangaka, like biographies. Like there's a lot of them out there. So when you're downstairs just checking out the graphic novel section, whoever's the first one down there to scoop it up, man, you're doing yourself a service, because Tatsumi's A Drifting Life is down
That's exactly
there.
what stood out to me. It's a big book. You can find it.
Yeah.
It's awesome.
And it's about this cartoonist who worked for a magazine called Garo, and it's sort of his like life story, getting into comics and all of that. It's a great book. But
he developed a style, a genre that was like, I'm going to say slice of life. That may not be the exact right term, but it was about like regular people, in an industry that's full of adventure and epic and fantasy. He would tell these stories about like Japanese people and really like street level stories and real life people. And it of course spawned its own genre, but he's like the founding father of that style. So it's pretty exciting to see his autobiography.
Even the term manga, it doesn't mean comics. It means something like quick sketch or something, because there was the Hokusai manga, which is the sketchbooks of Hokusai, the famous the wave drawing. And one of the things I like about Tatsumi's work is it was done with such speed that he couldn't lavish over the artwork like a Katsuhiro Otomo. So it's almost like the characters, the anthropomorphic characters in the comics almost become like the written character in Japanese, like with just the speed that the art was created in. But I think I saw the Tezuka biography down there too, man. So there's like all of those.
Footnote on the Tatsumi, if I'm not mistaken, that stuff is published in English by Drawn and Quarterly, so Canadian publisher. Bringing it all full circle.
It's true. All right, guys, it's going to be time to start wrapping things up a little bit, but maybe time for one more.
There's been a lot of like media conglomeration over time. Like, how would you see it working if like Marvel ever got wrapped in with DC? Like, how would that work? Do you think? It probably wouldn't happen.
If Marvel got wrapped in with what?
Yeah, like if DC and Marvel had to merge somehow, what would you think that would look like?
All right, the question is, a lot of media conglomeration has been happening, so if Marvel and DC merged, what would that look like? Well, great news. I know exactly what it would look like. Amalgam comics from the early 90s. There's a whole box of those you could dig through.
Yeah, and Dave, you just reminded me yesterday, like there was the Batman one. What was it called? Like the Dark Claw. Really is Tim Vigil's Faust.
I need to track that one down because I did not read it back in the day.
Yeah, he's got the exact same claws almost.
That's enough of a sales pitch for me.
Jimmy, we should wrap up, man. They got to get things situated for the headliner panel. But before we get out of here, we would be remiss if we didn't mention that we will be doing a signing downstairs tomorrow during the festival. Is it going to be at your table, Cal?
Yeah.
Okay. So we'll be at the Strange Adventures table, probably. What's that?
In the tent.
Yeah, in the tent, probably from 2 p.m. till 5. That's the end of the thing. So 2 p.m. till 5, we'll be in the tent at the Strange Adventures table doing the signing. Hope you guys enjoyed the festival tomorrow. Hope you guys enjoyed the talk. Is there any final points you want to hit, Jimmy?
One thing we didn't touch on much, I make zines, which are like mini comics, handmade, small books, and I brought some of those, so I'll have those tomorrow. For anybody that's a maker and interested in making their own books, I'll have a few of those to show off tomorrow to check out.
Let's wrap this up, man.
We do a normal wrap-up, and I'm always tempted to go into that spill, but it doesn't work in real life.
It does. Like, I see a couple Kayfabe shirts, man. So they sort of will know the score. How many? Can I see a show of hands? Who knows the YouTube channel at this point? Dude, they know the marching orders, man. Can I hear it on the count of three? Can you guys do that for me? 1, 2, 3. That was a little lukewarm. One more time. 1, 2, 3. Much better.
Thank you.